welcome. I'm Eric Laursen. This is Wayne Price. And the way we've sort of roughly set this up is that each of us is going to speak for about 20 minutes. I'm going to try and provide, I hope not too much background on, what's happened in the last really 2 years. A lot of that's, you've probably been following it in the newspapers. This is what the economic crisis is. I'm going to make some comments about sort of the background, some perspective on how this compares with previous economic crises and so forth. And Wayne is going to give the real nitty-gritty theory stuff. So, is that how you, well,
whatever, you're going to say whatever you want to say.
All right. So I'll start out, and then I hope we can, we can have a lot of time for discussion and so forth, which we'll try and moderate. Just for purposes of full disclosure, I did wear my Merrill Lynch T-shirt today. So if anything, any arrests are made at the Anarchist book fair, only the right people will be embarrassed. Very important.
Hey Eric.
Yes.
Since you're still youthful of wind and limb, could you stand while you speak?
Yeah, I can do that.
Yay.
I'll tell you what, I will do.
You're leaving me out. That's right. I don't have to do
Well,
that.
I can see you.
How about if I do this?
There you go.
I do this. This is pretty looking. Okay. What I want to do is give a little bit of an intro to what's happening, not the nitty-gritty details, but kind of a little perspective on this economic crisis, and then what we can do to respond to it and to, let's say, turn it to our advantage as anarchists and revolutionaries. Just, a quick thing, if you haven't been following the events of the last couple of years real closely and you want to get a good sense of what's going on, I will recommend 4 economists who are not anarchists but do a pretty good job of explaining what's going on. Dean Baker and James Galbraith, their work is pretty available on the web, and there's, believe it or not, 2 economists who write for the Times pretty regularly, Paul Krugman and Joe Nocera, who are worth taking a look at. But I want to give just a few things for context. Number one is this crisis is not a unique event. It's not something that came out of nowhere. It's actually the culmination of a kind of rolling economic crisis that's been going on for nearly 40 years within the state capitalist system in the United States and Europe and increasingly all over the world. It's been going on so long that it's actually seemed like normal to a lot of us. An awful lot of us weren't even born when it began. But it began, just for perspective again, with the financial dislocations that the Vietnam War caused in the late 60s. Then there were the oil shocks in the early 70s. Banks responded to that by kind of lurching from one mistaken business decision to another. 2 major banks, the Latin American debt crisis happened in the early 80s. 2 major American banks, Continental Illinois and Penn Square, collapsed at that time. The savings and loan crisis followed a few years later. The Mexican debt crisis came in the early 90s. Then there were the Russian and the Asian debt crises. Then there was the near collapse of a big hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management in 1998. Then there was the dot-com bubble. Then there was in the last 2 years, there's the collapse of the housing bubble. So there's been a crisis like literally every 4 or 5 years, stretching back for 40 years now. This is a kind of a long unfolding process. During that time, we've seen stagnating wages. We've seen a huge increase in consumer debt. People who live outside the fantasy economy of Wall Street, which gets bailed out every time one of these crises happens, have been living in a sort of an increasing state of precariousness. This, like I said, has come to seem normal to a lot of us over the past 40 years. But when you compare it with the 60s, the 50s, even the 40s, it's not normal at all. So, for example, we're hearing that the financial bailout that we're getting now could cost the public something like $3 trillion. What I'd like to know is what's the total cost of all the bailouts of the financial system that have taken place over the last 40 years. Now, that'd be a huge number, and if anybody knows, please let me know, because I think it would be a great one to be able to brandish around. What these crises have in common is that each time the Federal Reserve and the Treasury has to bail out some huge financial institutions. Sometimes they do it in under-the-table ways that disguise what they're doing so the taxpayers don't really know, but each time the taxpayers wind up paying for it. And we've been doing this for a very long time. And the reason is basically because the financial oversight system in this country is run by the same bankers and financiers who get the bailouts, and by economists with very, very close ties to them. So when people express outrage and disbelief at the money that's being poured down the bottomless holes of Citigroup and AIG, they shouldn't be. This is really standard operating procedure. For the last 40 years, this is what Geithner and Summers are doing. Bailing out the banks is exactly what the system's been doing for 40 years every time a bank gets in trouble. It's a standard operating procedure. What we want to be asking is how long people are going to put up with it this time, because this really is the biggest screw-up that they've made yet. Like I said, people are living through a level of shock right now that hasn't been felt since the Depression. There's something like $5 trillion of personal wealth that's vaporized in this country over the last 2 years because of the collapse of the housing bubble. Now, maybe a lot of that was inflated values, but for ordinary people, they were using those home values to leverage their homes in order to basically be able to afford health care, to be able to afford transportation for work, college for their kids, and it's now gone. It's disappeared. So there's a huge chunk of the economy that's literally vanished. This is a really devastating thing. And the amount that Washington is putting into helping these people by offering them some relief on mortgages, for example, is really pathetic when you compare it to the amount of money they're pouring into the banks. Stimulus package that Obama pushed through Congress is way too small to replace what's been lost. Already people in the administration are talking about how this deficit spending from the stimulus package, it can't go on for more than a year or two because we have to then get back to the serious business, which is budget cutting. So these people are living in fantasy land. They've got a very long learning curve between what's actually happened in the real world and what they're actually beginning to understand has happened. So what's the difference between the situation we've got now and the last time something this bad happened, which was during the 1930s, during the Depression? In 1929, the stock market crashed, and it was partly the result of roughly 10 years of total free market orthodoxy that allowed the financial center to run amok. The crisis today is partly the result of roughly 35 years of total free market orthodoxy in which the financial sector was allowed to run amok. The result is that free market orthodoxy is much more completely hardwired into the way that Washington thinks than it was in 1929. We have a Democratic administration, but it thinks much more like Herbert Hoover than it does like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So that's what I mean by a very long learning curve. These people are not understanding things the way the rest of us do. Now, what's going to happen as a result of this? Well, if you look back at the 30s again for perspective, there was huge social unrest during the early years of the Great Depression. The last general strike in the history of this country took place in the early 1930s. There were militant consumer groups that were attacking price gougers. There were radical groups promoting unorthodox economic ideas like a guaranteed income for everyone. There were local communities that when the Red Cross would not give them relief supplies, they would go and seize them. This happened all over. This happened in the Deep South, areas that we think of as very conservative. The Communist Party USA attained the largest membership it ever happened. It had hundreds of thousands of members in the early 1930s. So it wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a total crisis of legitimacy for the entire state capitalist system. It's a little like what happened in the 30s in this country is a little like what happened in Argentina in 2001, but on a much larger scale. But of course we didn't get a revolution then. We got a rejuvenated labor movement. We got a national social safety net. We got a political mechanism that was geared towards increasing the size of that safety net. We got a fairer tax structure, but we didn't get a revolution.